Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be with Tom Scharf today, who's Professor at University of Newcastle and current President of the British Society of Gerontology. Tom and I have known each other for over 10 years. And Tom's going to be presenting some thoughts and insights regarding ageism in the context of images and the media. So Tom, please start when you're ready.
Will do. Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about a topic which is very close to my heart. I'm going to focus on ageism, media representations and misrepresentations of later life. And I'll start with an apology for some of the terrible images that I'm going to be showing you over the next 30 minutes or so. What I want to do here is to start with a broad focus on a theme that has been central to my research and research of colleagues, which is around social exclusion in later life. And I want to locate the study of ageism and visual ageism within that wider debate on social exclusion. I'll then be looking at some of the ways in which aging has been represented, in particular during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, as a way of drawing attention to the ageist representations that characterize mainstream media when they're referring to issues around aging, longevity, and later life. And I'll be concluding then with some ideas about ways forward and how we might respond as societies to those misrepresentations of aging. So as a starting point, we can focus on the issue of social exclusion. Now, exclusion is regarded, and this is a work of Hilary Silver that goes back a number of years, but still is relevant, that social exclusion is defined here as a multidimensional process of progressive social rupture, detaching groups and individuals from social relations and institutions, and preventing them from full participation in the normatively prescribed activities of the society in which they live. So according to this approach, exclusion is about an inability to participate in what most people would regard as a reasonable standard way of life. And in terms of exclusion in older age, going back over the last 20 years or so, I think there's an increasing focus on some of the key issues around the ways in which older people may be affected somewhat differently from processes of exclusion than other groups within society. And this has been evident in particular through recent work through the RoseNet Cost Action. This was a collaboration of around 180 scientists based in over 40 different countries, not just in Europe, but beyond Europe. And the work that is represented in this recently published book on social exclusion in later life emphasizes some key features of exclusion as it relates to older people. The first, which I'll be picking up on shortly, is the multidimensionality of social exclusion. So exclusion affects many different spheres of a person's life, of a group's experience of aging. We also know that exclusion is dynamic, that it varies over the course of an individual's life, but also affects generations and birth cohorts over long periods of time. There is evidence increasingly of the ways in which an experience of exclusion in later life differs from experiences earlier in the life course. And a good example here is of the area of poverty, exclusion from material resources. The argument often represented in policy discourse is that if people are poor early in life, the best way to lift people out of poverty is for them to enter the labor market, to find work and to earn an income. Well, these opportunities are fewer and further between for people in later life for all sorts of reasons. And the fourth point here is about the way in which particular groups of older adults are disproportionately affected by individual but also multiple forms of exclusion. So people in advanced old age, 80, 85 and over, may be disproportionately affected by poverty or by loneliness or lack of civic participation, just to give a few examples there. And this is the framework that we've been using to explore a range of questions around social exclusion, which also leads me into the study of ageism and visual forms of ageism. So we've described exclusion in later life as being this complex process that involves the lack or denial of resources, rights, goods, and services as people age, and the inability to participate in normal relationships and activities available to most people across the different domains of society. And when it comes to ageism, right, alongside exclusion from material resources or exclusion from social relations, we refer to ageism as being a feature of this dimension called sociocultural exclusion. And this itself has a number of sub-dimensions. There's that symbolic form of exclusion that's represented through negative images, negative representations of particular groups, or also the invisibility of groups within society. So there are some groups who are marginalized, who we don't read about, who we don't see in public discourse, in research even, that they're excluded symbolically from debates around aging in later life. And then we also have this form of identity exclusion that Amanda Grenier and Nancy Guberman refer to as the dismissal or the diminishment of distinctive and multiple identities of people, of groups, through their reduction to the single identity of age. So people who may be female or living with disabilities or caring or working, whatever it is, they're reduced to that single identity of being an older person. So how does this then fit with standard work around ageism? Well, like social exclusion, there's been a lot of work focusing on ageism in recent years that builds on a body of knowledge going back to the late 1960s. And Liet Ayalon and Clemens Tesch-Römer describe ageism as being the complex, often negative construction of old age, which takes place at the individual and the societal levels. And that's a really neat way of presenting a really complex range of research evidence that identifies the different ways in which aging is negatively constructed and how this affects individuals and how it characterizes society as a whole. And in the UK, Julia Johnson and Bill Bytheway's pioneering work on ageism also drew attention to the varied forms of ageism that exist, that we'll see in some of the imagery that is represents aging through the period of COVID. So we get this institutionalized form of ageism where old age is negatively represented in the welfare state, in, for example, in age cutoffs for eligibility to various welfare benefits, disability benefits in particular. We get internalized forms of ageism where people who are aging view their future lives or their own aging as being in some way disadvantageous, something to be overcome and addressed. So people are talking about, being good for their age when it comes to their health. That these reflect those ageist, internalized ageist views. And then, of course, that dominant form of ageism characterized by what Johnson, by the way, referred to as benevolent patronage. This is the idea that society should in some way look after our most vulnerable older people, that badges people as being vulnerable based solely on their chronological age. More recently, and this comes even closer to the topic today, there's been some really interesting work around visual forms of ageism. And I like this definition by Los and Ivan, who talk about visual ageism as being the social practice of visually underrepresenting older people or misrepresenting them in a prejudiced way. And this, in the exclusion frame, coincides with forms of symbolic exclusion and also forms of identity exclusion. And that really is the foundation for some of the images that I'm now going to introduce that have been picked up over the course of the pandemic. I would say that this is not based on a strong empirical foundation. These are insights from my own reading of the media landscape, but there's some empirical work to be done by me and by others in terms of reinforcing the foundations for this. So here we can start with what may seem as a reasonably benign image. It's a widely used image in mainstream media in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, in international media, that shows an older man clutching his walking stick. Now, on a one-off basis, this might seem relatively unimportant, but then if we look to where the same image is used across a wide range of reporting, we start to get the idea that there's something going wrong here in the way in which aging is represented. So the same image has been used to refer to stories around the shielding of older adults during the period of COVID, the way in which nursing home staff feel drained by their caring roles, the legal challenges placed on relatives wishing to visit family members in care homes, and the whole host of unmet care needs. So across a range of stories that relate to aging in some way, the same images get used and reused and perpetuate that sense of a loss of identity, of a reduction of individuals to a set of wrinkled hands and walking sticks. And these really are the ubiquitous images that characterize aging in media representations today, especially during the period of the COVID pandemic, where older people disproportionately have been affected by poor health outcomes and increased mortality rates. So we have the ubiquity of hands images. These are images that visually misrepresent older people in a prejudiced way, using the major stock image libraries that media organizations draw on. We can say, using the language of visual ageism, that here we see older people being reduced to a single, predominantly negative identity. And these hands images are everywhere and are used across a wide range of stories in the mainstream media to represent all manner of questions relating to aging and later life, emphasizing frailty, vulnerability, dependency, decline, proximity to death, social isolation, and loneliness. And anyone doing a quick scan of stories, whether it's on the BBC or in the Guardian or the Daily Telegraph, whether it's the Irish Times or the Independent in Ireland, if you look across all of these media outlets, you find examples of these images where the default is, if there's a story about healthcare and social care needs in later life, we get these types of images used to illustrate it. Nothing that relates to positive, more realistic representations of what it means, what it feels like to be older in the United Kingdom today. And if you just think that I'm focusing primarily on hands and on walking sticks, well, you'd be wrong, because there's another body of images that seems to draw primarily on the lower body halves of older people. And what could be more depersonifying than these types of images that are not of complete older people, that emphasize a lack of personhood, a lack of identity, and a lack of diversity, sorry. The image of an older person sitting on a bench, well, surely this is a positive image. If the whole person was being represented, that's somebody who's left their home using their mobility aids and is sitting in a public space, contributing in some way to society, meeting their daily needs, living their everyday life. This shouldn't be stigmatized as an image in a way that emphasizes the loss of personhood, the lack of identity. Sometimes the experience of visual ageism also is reflected in the stereotypical portrayal of aging and later life. So one of the stereotypes that is perpetuated through the media is that old age is synonymous with isolation and with loneliness. And here's a great example from a Guardian story that was reporting on a really interesting research study that emphasized that 16 to 29-year-old people were twice as likely to be experiencing loneliness as people aged 70 and over. And the story, the image to illustrate this story is not of somebody aged 16 to 29 who's experiencing loneliness. It's an image of somebody over the age of 70 perhaps, who is less likely to be lonely. So it's a perpetuation of the stereotype, the negative stereotype associated with aging, that people know somehow that aging and loneliness go hand in hand. Well, that isn't the case. The evidence doesn't suggest that. Yes, loneliness is a major issue and we need to address loneliness and think about isolation, but we shouldn't be perpetuating these negative stereotypes in this way. And more recently, we also find examples where the mainstream media will pick up on reports that emphasize the risks associated with ageism, but they'll then illustrate those stories with the very stereotypical ageist images that the researchers are criticizing in their evidence base. So here's a story about age bias. Right? The assumption that all older people are frail and helpless is a common incorrect stereotype. So thank you, CNN, for drawing attention to this important story. But the image that accompanies the story is exactly one of those images that devalues older people, that emphasizes age bias, that points to older people as being frail and helpless. It's a negative and incorrect stereotype. My final image is of another type. It's not a photographic image, it's some sort of composite, which really draws attention to what Johnson and By the Way would refer to as benevolent ageism. These are the clasped hands around a representation of an older couple bent over, the man with a walking stick inside a glass bauble. All of this emphasizes the need to protect, to wrap our hands around frail older people because of the risks that they might face if they weren't being protected in this way. And again, it's an image that is widely used across the media and on websites and in very many different places. The there are, alongside some of those negative representations, I should also maybe draw attention here to the more positive representations of aging that also equate to ageism and visual forms of ageism. This is an image, it's a composite image used by the New York Post, where the original photo of a baby boomer couple on their yacht dressed in linen and obviously very wealthy, but that wasn't a subtle enough representation of a baby boomer couple. So somehow the New York Post has managed to superimpose these dollar bills all over the image just to emphasize the fact that older people are disproportionately wealthy and younger people are struggling to get along. So here we can have an image that represents a model of successful aging, but is also prejudicial and potentially contributes to intergenerational tensions. There are then, on that basis, having presented some of the evidence about the ways in which media companies have misrepresented aging in later life over the course of ageism, what I would say is that over the last year and a half, there has been an unprecedented global response around ageism, whether that's at the level of the United Nations or the World Health Organization, as a coordinated attempt to draw attention to ageism and then to generate meaningful responses. And what the pandemic has done is emphasized the necessity of tackling ageism in its different forms. It emphasizes the need for multiple responses from across science, policy, industry, and the public sector. And we also need to think about restructuring the supply and demand of images in later life to better reflect the realities of aging. So one of the positive responses that I would identify are something like the work by the Cochrane Reviews, who have produced a really nice set of guidelines on using non-stigmatizing visual images of people with a range of health conditions at the different stages of life. And as you can see from this image, it highlights what it is that should be avoided and draws attention to the more positive images that are acceptable in here, in this case, in use by researchers, but also this would apply, I would say, to media organizations. We've also had some really strong contributions from organizations that represent age interests. In this case, Age Platform Europe have produced a very straightforward guide to how to use images to better represent aging and later life. And they argue for the need to have photos, images that show people's faces, that represent diversity, avoiding pictures of hunched older people, group pictures that identify older people as being part of a vibrant social network, active representations of older people, not just sitting, not just holding walking sticks, but going about their daily business, whether that's shopping or taking part in leisure activities, and also color rather than black and white or sepia images. And then for organizations that are still challenged by the high number of stigmatizing images in the stock image banks, we also have now a very useful resource from the Centre for Aging Better, who've produced this free library of positive and realistic images of people aged 50 and over. Now, this is clearly a work in progress, but the images that are used, that are presented in this resource, can be easily accessed by all sorts of organizations and present a very different view of aging in later life that is much closer to, I think, how we would all like this to be in our societies. And, you know, I should also be giving credit where credit's due in terms of some of the images that are used in the media, and thinking about ways in which we can move towards more inclusive representations of aging in the media. And this is an image that I really like to go back to. It's of Margaret Keenan, who was the first person to receive a COVID-19 vaccine towards the end of 2020. And this is exactly the sort of image that we should be looking at, that emphasizes a woman who is not frail, who's not vulnerable, who's independent, she's engaged, she's taking the vaccine and contributing to society. A lovely photo. And that photo, a year on, shows her at the age of 91, receiving her COVID-19 booster vaccination alongside the nurse who administered the first vaccination. So this is also a really strong image that points to how older age really is, but in this case emphasizes what I would regard as intergenerational solidarity. Some concluding thoughts then. So going back to the scientific ideas around social exclusion, I think it's really helpful to connect the ideas on exclusion to long-standing debates on ageism and age discrimination, and using visual images is one of the ways in which we can do this. And there's a lot of thinking to be done by researchers around these topics. I'd also say, from a social exclusion perspective, that a focus on ageism allows us to think about the ways in which sociocultural exclusion intersects with other forms of exclusion. So the connections between poverty and deprivation and ageism, the connections between loneliness and isolation, between participation in civic activities, neighborhood connections, access to services, amenities, and mobility. Ageism is relevant to each of these areas, and there's a lot of work to be done to spell out some of the connections between these different domains of exclusion. And the final point there is about the value of considering the dynamic nature of sociocultural exclusion over the course of the life course. So some people will experience forms of exclusion, you know, earlier in life. So people who are aging with disability will be very familiar with negative representations of their disabled status. That then is compounded as they age with that sort of reduction of their identity around aging and disability to a single negative identity, but also the dynamic nature and the way in which ageism and exclusion work across generations. So I've finished with a few references for people who'd like to read more around the topic that I've been presenting here. And that then is my presentation. So I can maybe stop sharing my screen now and pick up on some questions.
Thanks, Tom. That was a great presentation. Excuse me. I mean, you know, you and I follow each other on Twitter, and, you know, throughout the beginning of the pandemic, you know, I saw you were tweeting a lot about the images and visual representations in the media of ageism. And, you know, it's great to see, you know, you spoke about the publication from the cost action and, you know, being able to connect and see the relationships with social exclusion. I have a couple of questions for you. And my first question is, what are one or two of the biggest challenges that you faced, be it currently or in the past, or maybe both, in your discipline, your career?
I love big questions, Hannah, and that's a really nice place to start. And I guess people would be expecting me to respond with something around ageism and age discrimination, but actually I would like to look much more broadly than this and focus on inequalities. And this is has been one of the core concerns in social gerontology going back, a number of years, back to the work of people like Peter Townsend, Chris Phillipson and Alan Walker. And I think there is no bigger challenge really than inequalities that affect aging in later life. And we see that in so many different ways, but one of the most visible ways is in terms of differences in life expectancy and healthy life expectancy in a country like the UK, where there can be a 10-year gap in average male life expectancy between different parts of an individual city or between different cities across the United Kingdom. And these differences are not getting smaller, the gap's actually getting bigger. So there's something going wrong somewhere along the line, that people who are contributing to society through their working lives in all sorts of ways are dying prematurely and are unable to make the most of the opportunities that exist, that can be enjoyed through a longer, later life. So I think the big issues really are around understanding inequalities and then understanding why inequalities are growing and are not declining. And then that leads me into the second big challenge really, which is the policy challenge. Is that I find it absolutely incredible that for an aging society where we've known about the challenges as well as the opportunities around aging that have existed, these are the underpinnings of our field in social gerontology. We know a lot about this. How come we don't have a proper aging strategy in the United Kingdom? Something that is multifaceted, that targets inequalities in a much more coordinated and joined up way, that says, right, we can't go on living in a country where the gap is widening between the wealthiest and the poorest. So a strategy that has its focus reducing the inequalities that characterize aging in later life, but then also tackles ageism and age discrimination, that also looks at the role of digitalization in terms of the opportunities as well as the challenges related to aging populations, that connects to all of the really important work around the longevity economy and aging and innovation, the opportunities and challenges associated with longer working lives. None of this is at all joined up in the United Kingdom at the moment. So, I don't think we'll be able to even start reducing inequalities unless we have some type of overarching plan that identifies what the key priorities are in terms of an aging society.
Tom, I just want to follow up with this strategy and framework you just mentioned. And obviously it's policy related and multifaceted with various actors within our communities and in counties and as well as nationally. I guess I'm being a bit naughty when I ask this question. Why do you think that, we're now in the 21st century? The field of gerontology has been around for many decades, which can be studied, and there's conferences and people like yourself and myself and others who do various research. Why do you think there isn't a strategy?
I think that's a really good question. I think some of this partly reflects that institutionalized form of ageism that Julia Johnson, Bill Bytheway would refer to, is that somehow failure to acknowledge that this is a really important issue, that this is something that is further down the road than it actually is, that it'll, you know, if we muddle along, somehow we'll get by. But aging is, you know, on a similar standing to digitalization and to climate change and the loss of biodiversity, that this is something we've known about for so long and need to respond to. And I think in government, it reflects a fragmentation in their approach, is that aging periodically is seen as a matter for health and social care, at other times it's seen as a matter for the Department for Work and Pensions. Obviously around digitalization, it's, you know, digital, the sort of culture and media, you know, so it's spread across departments and isn't thought of as being important enough for its own coordinating unit. I just think there's an inability to view this as the major topic that it is. And then we live in this state of perpetual crisis around social care, for example, or around healthcare. So many of the drivers for increasing cost of social care and healthcare are to do with demographic aging, but that isn't really acknowledged anywhere. So we need to be putting many more resources into our health and care systems, as well as into the labour markets, into skills and training, planning for extended working lives, you know, all sorts of things around home supports, neighbourhood and community supports. And I just think there's just a tremendous missed opportunity that recognises the inability to take this seriously. So periodically we get, you know, some good reports by House of Lords committees or by parliamentary committees on different aspects of the ageing agenda, but none of that is properly coordinated.
And we've seen it in regards to the age-friendly cities and communities discourse, haven't we, as well as the digital divide and digital poverty. It's not, obviously it's also older people, but also younger communities or younger cohorts as well that are being affected by institutionalized aging.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the really key developments in recent years, is the way in which ageism focuses not just on or misrepresentations of aging in later life, but also affects younger people. And it's good to see those campaigns that focus on ageism affecting different age groups within society. And it affects all of us at different, you know, with our different identities at different points of our life.
So my next, I mean, you and I could talk about this forever, but we don't have the time today. My next question is, what one or two positives have you experienced, be it in the past or currently in your discipline, your work?
Wow. You know, I do love working in social gerontology. It gives me a lot of pleasure, and I, you know, always have enjoyed my doctoral supervisions and bringing new people into the field over the course of, you know, going back a good number of years now. I think one of the really positive developments is the focus on interdisciplinarity, and that really you know, privileged position that we have as gerontologists of being able to engage with people from all sorts of other disciplines, and to open their eyes to some of the core questions that we have in gerontology. So whether you're working with colleagues in oral history, or people in computing science, or in some of the arts and humanities disciplines who traditionally may not have looked at age and life courses being core to the area that they're working in, it's like suddenly it opens up a whole new agenda for them, as well as then, of course, we have so much to learn from the disciplinary traditions that other people work with. But social gerontology is by nature a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary enterprise. And that's something that we should really celebrate and also draw on, and accept that people will move into our field and maybe move out of our field back to their discipline of origin, but hopefully having learned quite a bit along the way about the value of an aging of a life course perspective. I think the other focus that I would really draw attention to, and why I've stayed within the field of gerontology, is the collegiality. It has always felt quite different to me, working in gerontology to working in other sort of more narrow disciplinary fields. My own training was in political science. That's where I did my PhD, and I transitioned into gerontology shortly after my PhD, and I just found the gerontology community to be much more supportive, much more willing to engage with early career researchers, less dogmatic, than the field of political science as it was back in the sort of early 1990s. And I'd like to think that we've remained a supportive collegial area that welcomes new people in, people who can build their careers with a focus on age-related questions. Now, that might just be my own perception of gerontology. There may be people who've left because they find us not at all welcoming, but I've built up strong working relationships and supportive collaborations with people over many years within gerontology, and I really value those relationships.
And I have to agree with you, Tom. I mean, my background was originally computing, and I came to the discipline of gerontology 16 years ago and attended my first BSG in 2007 at Sheffield. And it was great to meet yourself and meet colleagues within BSG, papers I read that you all had written, and bridging from my perspective interdisciplinary research of computing technology with gerontology, looking at where we are now during the pandemic. We know how important digital technologies and practices have been for the last 18 months, nearly 2 years. And like yourself, we've met some great people, haven't we? We've listened to some great research and worked with some fantastic individuals.
Yeah, it is a privilege to work in this area, and it's good also that the research funding councils and various funding bodies recognise the value of that interdisciplinary approach and are able to support us in terms of accessing the funds that we need to conduct our work.
And also, yeah, I totally agree. And with early career researchers and junior faculty members, they've been able to access funding as well through national bodies, to keep that momentum and that discourse going as well.
Yeah, this was one of the really lovely features of the RoseNet cost action work that we did, that of the 180 or so researchers involved, there was a good proportion who were early career researchers who are finishing their PhDs now, informed by the social exclusion agenda, but then taking that work wherever they go in terms of their postdocs and hopefully tenured positions in the longer term, although that is not always guaranteed.
Very precarious at the moment, isn't it? My kind of final question, and it's a bit of a two-parter. Based on the presentation that you've delivered today, how do you think ageism in the media should change, and who should be involved to make that change or changes?
Well, I think that's also is a really good question, and you know, even though I've, you know, through my images, I'm drawing attention to everything that goes wrong, I don't think that the solution is just bashing the mainstream media and telling them that their images are ageist and stereotypical. I think what we need is a much more collaborative way forward, so that we're not going to produce the change that we need without the different components of the, you know, the different stakeholders coming together somehow and working out what the best strategy forward is. So that involves the picture editors who are choosing images to accompany journalists' reports. They have to make those decisions, you know, within a matter of seconds, and they'll go to the first images that come at the top of the image libraries, often without having any chance to think about what it is they're doing. So we need to engage in dialogue with newspaper editors, with picture editors, with journalists, but that also then involves academics, it involves local authorities who also use a lot of images in their reports. You know, there are many, so this isn't something that is just for academics to do or just for age sector organizations to do. There needs to be some proper stakeholder mapping, is how I would describe this, to see who actually needs to be around the table or around the screen to have this adult conversation. That, you know, we can't go on like we're doing, representing older age in this entirely negative way. We wouldn't do it with other marginalized groups within society where this has become, you know, unacceptable. So we need to think about making this unacceptable in relation to older age. There is also then, you know, a practical change that needs to be made around the editor's code. Age is not regarded as one of the key characteristics within the code of editors. So there's a very practical change that could be made there that would then encourage the media, encourage the mainstream press to take seriously the way in which they write about age and present age. I've been focusing very much on visual representations, but as you know, Hannah, there's equally awful work going on around the language of aging. Right? We see this recently in a return to the awful terms of bed blockers and
Elderly.
also the elderly, people being vulnerable. In my own local paper, a report recently about an OAP. You know, it's a long time since people have been referred to as old age pensioners. It's something that no longer exists. So why is this, you know, dated term then represented in a newspaper headline in some way? So we need to, so there are also good guidelines around appropriate use of language, also from Age Platform Europe as it happens. So I think this is not something that, you know, academics can or should be doing on their own. I would say this is really important to do as part of an aging strategy, is to also be thinking about how we talk about age and later life. And it's not, doesn't mean just focusing excessively on the positives and the opportunities, because that can go too far as well, but just to be a bit more realistic and aware of what it is we're doing when we talk about older people, or when we try to represent them through images in some way.
What I noticed, Tom, and I don't know whether you picked up on it during the pandemic, I know we're still in it, but last year with certain briefings, shall we say, at 5 p.m, individuals at those briefings were using the term elderly. And my personal viewpoint is, if there's individuals who are involved in health and medicine using the word elderly, how can this see change happen?
I think we have to just work and accept that this needs a cultural shift, and that over time, this sort of language, the terminology, will change, but it won't change without advocacy and without, you know, somebody with, without it being drawn to people's attention that language is important, that images are important, and that we can yield all sorts of benefits for society if we get this right. So ageism is associated with all sorts of negative health and care outcomes. And so we can reduce the perceived burdens on our health and care system in a small way, perhaps, but in a meaningful way if we get this right. And then we can eradicate the use of certain terms, but just by making them unacceptable. The healthcare system is riddled with negative ways in which older people are described, and the British Geriatric Society, alongside the British Society of Gerontology, is doing their best, I think, to address this challenge. But you know, this is a long-term challenge, and you know, we benefit then from the support of global organizations like the United Nations, like World Health Organization, who make tackling ageism one of their key priorities.
And I know, you know, you and I and friends and colleagues of ours in the field of gerontology, you know, we use terms like older adults, don't we? Older people. And I think, you know, as you say, it's a long-term strategy and cultural change. And I think it would be nice, you know, if we saw on, as you say, on newspapers and magazines, the words older adults or older people rather than OAP.
Yeah, let's just keep pushing that and reminding people when they step over the mark that this is in some way not an especially good look, that they can do so much better, that older people is only 2 words, so is the elderly. You know, it's not as if it's going to, you know, the headlines are going to somehow become excessively long. It just is so much more respectful and acknowledges the identity and personhood of many of their readers, many of their viewers.
I totally agree. Tom, before we finish, is there anything else that you would like to add?
At this point, I think probably not, Hannah. I think you've quizzed me well enough and given me the opportunity to say much more than I probably needed to say on various topics. So I really appreciate having the chance to do that.
That's great. And Tom, thank you very much again. And for anybody who's going to be watching this, you know, Tom is on Twitter and you'll be able to find and follow him. He posts some great tweets, and his Twitter handle will be available via the YouTube channel. So thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Tom. I really do appreciate your time and effort that you've given to this presentation this afternoon.